Hello, conspirators. This is Amanda, and we have a very special treat for you this week. This is an episode we love of Historical Homos, which I know that the title is going to be enough for many of you out there, but in case you want to know more about what this is and why you should listen, Historical Homos is a deeply researched and deliciously saucy podcast about the gayest stories that history has never told. Each week, my friend, host Bash, is joined by his brilliant guests from historians to authors to activists to dish on the lives of the most fascinating LGBTQ plus figures who ever lived. They explore every hint and whisper in the LGBT and Q archive, from canonical queers like Alexander the Great and Virginia Woolf to the lesser known but equally fascinating figures like rent boys in ancient Rome, saphists in revolutionary France, and the most toxic boyfriends in Greek mythology. Y'all have a leg up there. I know you know who we're talking about, okay? If someone in history ever referred to two people as, quote, roommates, Historical Homos is on the case. Now, there are more than 75 episodes in their archive for you to enjoy. It's gossip, it's informed, it's researched, it's fun. And the whole point of the show is that queer people have been here since we invented being fabulous back at the beginning of time. So I hope that you enjoy this episode of Historical Homos. We loved it. We know you are going to love it too. And when you enjoy the show, when you want to subscribe, look up Historical Homos right here in your podcast app. Anywhere you can get spirits, you can get Historical Homos too. Their website, if you want to know more, is historicalhomos.com. All right, everybody, enjoy.
Welcome back to Historical Homos, the world's only no fucks given guide to queer history. I am buzzing with excitement today. First of all, I'm sitting in London. I have a warm cup of tea. I'm wearing the equivalent of coastal grandma chic for men. And the wind is howling outside. It's all very spooky, very scary, which is perfect because today we are talking about the queer history of witchcraft. I love witchcraft. I cannot stress this enough. When I was a young gay, I was a full-blown Wiccan. I bought book after book, most of them written by the eminent witch Silver Ravenwolf. I watched Charmed like it was a documentary. Practical Magic, Nicole Kidman, Sandra Bullock, who's actually the better witch. Nobody talks about that. I mean, I've seen it all. I've done it all. I've played dress up in every situation. And I guess you start to wonder, why do you care so much about these creatures? What do you identify with? And I think the typical thing would be like, oh, well, they're sort of different. They're alienated. And so am I because I'm a young homosexual. But actually, I don't think it's that. It's not so simple. It's the fact that witches have power, that they have this ability to fight back. They resist. They threaten some kind of order, some kind of established order. They fuck shit up. That's what makes witches so alluring. But the question is, how did they get to be so iconic for little old me? For one thing, it seems like every civilization has some version of witches. Why? Where does that come from? Why are people obsessed with magic historically and still today? And why did people then become so afraid of witches? Why did they persecute them and pursue them constantly? What's the role of witchcraft in our society and witch hunts? And did witches become icons for queer people in the West because they were persecuted in those ways? It's time we get to the bottom of all of it. So pull out your pointy hat and your wand and a rabbit, Chapel Roan style, because we're about to dive in, and the water in the witch's cauldron is a phenomenally sensual human temperature.
So let's go back in time and take another rewrite through our history. Celebrate ourselves tonight and cover all the things that's still a mystery. Cause if you think you know, you don't know, around the world we go, 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 go. Time to blow your mind with historical homos, historical homos, historical homos.
And we are back. I am thrilled to welcome into your little ear holes Professor Marion Gibson. Professor Gibson, thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I should have actually introduced you as Professor of Renaissance and Magical Literatures, because I swear to God, that's a Hogwarts title if I ever heard one. I cannot believe you have magical literatures in your job title. That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard.
I was pretty pleased with it, I have to say.
Okay, so Marion, I'm going to call you Marion, by the way, because Professor Gibson is just too much. I like to start with 3 questions. Number 1, how are you? Number 2, who are you? We kind of already covered that, Professor of Magical Literatures. And number 3, and most interestingly, what's inspiring you right now? So I'll let you do it all.
Yeah, I am fine. Thank you. Yes, I am a professor at the University of Exeter in southwest England, and I teach history students primarily. What's inspiring me? Actually, I was thinking about this and I was thinking, you could say something really cool. I don't know, music or film or something. And actually what I thought of was history podcasts, because I'm doing an increasing, I know, cool, isn't it? I'm doing an increasing number of these. Exactly. And they are just brilliant. I've come to think of them as a kind of university beyond university. And I just think that's absolutely brilliant that we can do this for ourselves.
It's so true. I often think about, how in the 18th century you would go and you would kind of talk about things and learn things. I feel like podcasts kind of fulfill that role a little bit for people. And like you say, like they allow us to be continuing students, especially those of us, those nerdy of the bunch who actually run these podcasts. This is my PhD that I am not getting any credit for. Just attention and likes and subscribes.
There
like,
you
share,
go.
subscribe.
You get thousands and thousands of listeners. This is great. Who wouldn't want that?
And that is true currency in today's world. Now, Marion, I have to ask the question on everybody's lips. Are you yourself a practicing witch?
I am not. I know it's very boring. I am a practicing historian, however, and what I write about is the history of witch trials and the idea of the witching culture, if you like.
Yeah. How did you get into this business, this witchy business?
I was at university and I took this final year course or module or whatever called Renaissance Magic. And in about week 4, they gave us this account of an Elizabethan witch trial. And I got really excited by just being able to read the voices of ordinary people, predominantly ordinary women who were accused of witchcraft. And I thought, what is going on here? Why don't we normally hear from these people? Where else would they possibly be recorded? Look, they do seem to be victims on the one hand, but as you said earlier, they're also imagined as powerful and they tell their own stories. And isn't that interesting? So if it was kind of all downhill from there, I just couldn't get away after that.
Oh, I just love that. I love how there are certain things in history that you can always go back to and it just never runs out of fascination potential. What I want to get to in this episode is let's start with the real history, the hardcore history. Where does witchcraft come from? And then I want to talk a little bit about the transformation of witchcraft in the more Christian era, because it seems like that's when trials and witch hunts got a little more serious, at least in the West. And then I want to see what happens to witchcraft in the colonial era, because it feels like it changes again then. And then in the 20th century, it becomes interesting again, and especially in England and America, it feels. And then we get to, the 90s when I was born, when it's this big phenomenon that queer people really identify with. I mean, I was just reading today that a pretty large proportion of practicing Wiccans identify as LGBTQ or plus. Something like anywhere from 30 to 50%, according to this study. So I'd like to close talking about that at the end. Sound good?
Sound good.
Act 1, When Witches Were Lit. Okay, now there's a double entendre in this act title, because I do believe that before Christianity, witches were not necessarily feared in quite the same way. I mean, I'm more of an ancient history girly, and everything I know about ancient magic says that it was like kind of acceptable, like it was part of their worldview. But just before we even get into that, can you just offer us some thoughts, some reflections in your study of magic and magical literature? Why do so many societies have this? Why does everyone have magic? Where do you think that comes from?
I think it's built into us, both because we're always looking for people to persecute, because unfortunately that seems to be who we are as people, which is a bad thing. But on the other hand, we're also always looking for something fantastical and beautiful as well. That's the other side of us. And I think the idea that magic gives you power, even when you realize in your daily life, maybe you don't have any or you don't have as much as you, magic offers you that opportunity to wiggle your nose or click your fingers and suddenly you are a powerful person. And I think it's that kind of push and pull towards power and yet also towards persecuting other people because, hey, what if they have the magic power and you don't?
I love what you just evoked in terms of magic is almost an acknowledgement of our powerlessness as humans in a way. It stands in, it fills that gap, that vacuum of power that we experience as beings in nature in a much more powerful universe than we can possibly understand. Because, of course, historically, we have to understand people believed in this. This was real to them. This was not it. And that's probably very difficult for most of us to understand because it is fun. It is charmed. It is Wicca. It is all of these things that seem kind of like extracurricular. But actually, it was very real to them. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, I'm not sure how much you've done on ancient magic specifically, but I'm just curious, like, if that could set the bar a little bit for us. Because in Greece and Rome, as far as I understand, I mean, people are casting spells. They are making potions. There are spell books even, I think. So what was the deal in the ancient world and why was it more accepted?
They were a lot more relaxed about magic, certainly, than later religions were. And that, I think, was because they thought there could be both good and bad magic. They thought there were bad magicians and these people should be punished. And there were also poisoners and, people who used herbs in ways that they didn't like. And they regarded those kind of people as bad. But almost everybody had some sort of investment in magic. And the pagan religions, because they were polytheistic, they had a whole range of gods and goddesses. They were a lot more welcoming of ideas of magic than the later religions, the monotheistic religions with a patriarchal god tended to be.
That last bit seems very important, patriarchal god, because from the research that I've done, it seems like there's a huge patriarchal element to defining witches as sort of non-women or irregular women or wrong women, almost in a way that let's talk about that. Where does the witch as the evil woman come from? Because I think people probably have two images in their mind in the more like Christian Western fairy tale world of there's the kind of peasant pagan woman who like gathers herbs in the forest and she's a good witch. And then there's the hag in the little house waiting for the kids to fall in the cauldron so she can have her supper.
Yeah, that's right. So people did think, say we're in 1600, right? So, we're in Christian Europe, we're in 1600. What do we think about witches? You're quite right. On the one hand, you might see there are people in your village that practice magic. And maybe they offer you kind of healing charms or they'll come around and do a rite over your newborn child or they'll offer some prayers, which are actually perfectly Christian, but they'll do it in a way that's kind of magical because they're not supposed to have that priestly power. Those people are fine. You don't necessarily think of those people as witches, but they use magic. And that's where we get the idea of the good witch from, that those people are kind of tolerated. But on the other hand, and sometimes the same people fall into this other hand, you've got the bad witch, somebody who doesn't help you. Instead, they curse you and they don't bless your child. They instead try to kill it. And obviously, if you were a good witch, you were a helpful healing person and something went wrong during the course of your healing spell, say, it was very easy for you to fall into that persona of the bad witch. So again, they're kind of two sides of the same coin, but people in Christian Europe absolutely did start to look out for the bad witch. They thought, on the one hand, they lived in a really magical world, like you say, a world where they absolutely believed in witches. And they looked around them and they thought, well, if God's got his good people, including maybe good healers, but primarily clergymen and magistrates and those sort of people, they're God's people. Then on the other hand, surely the devil must have his people in the world too. And, that could be my neighbour. That could be my neighbour I fell out with the other day. And then something horrible happened in my home. So they start looking out for witches. They start looking out for evil people. And you could say that was a kind of 15th, 16th century phenomenon.
Where does the word witch come from? I just realized I've never thought about this.
It's really old. It does seem to come from Wicca, which is a word that you recognise, obviously, which is an Anglo-Saxon word meaning something like wise person. So it seems to be connected to that idea of wisdom and power, which can be good on the one hand, but can be really abused on the other.
There's something very primal about that. There's something very hunter-gatherer vibes of the people who transmit wisdom you probably see that in more pre-industrial societies or like tribes or things like that. Like people who know about spiritual things are seen to have that kind of wisdom, that kind of power to bless, to pray on behalf of the community, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there is this really positive side to it. Let me ask a question also. Do we actually think that there were lots of pagans running around in the Christian era, sort of, because that's kind of a myth, of, the old ways were preserved by the good witches, under cover of darkness. Is there any of that?
It is kind of a myth. It's a shame, really, isn't it? But it is. I mean, people certainly, they're still using old charms that look like they go right back to the early medieval period. And occasionally you get the name of a pagan god, or some sort of old hero figure from a really, really distant past in those charms. So it's not totally impossible. And what you were saying earlier about, the good witches, if you like, being kind of shamans, that's also really interesting, because that, again, is like an older figure, at least in Western Europe. So it's not impossible that there are elements of paganism, but there absolutely isn't, sadly, a pagan cult of thousands of people, highly organised, preserving an old religion, fighting against Christianity.
Right.
That was really an idea people came up with in the 19th century. And it was a very cool idea. And we get a lot of kind of folk horror and all of that lovely Halloween-y stuff that we all really like. That comes out of that idea that it's a witch cult. There you go. But actually probably not in history.
Because there is a lot, especially in Britain, there is a very strong literary tradition of Merlin. And, there's this idea that before Christianity, there was and I guess Druids and all of that. So that must inform that kind of mythology as well, of there was a world before we found Jesus, where everyone was walking around cutting down mistletoe and, praying to the sacred oak.
It's such a great idea, isn't it? And you just think, I would like to have seen that world. That sounds really fascinating. But by the time you get to 1600, it's a very, very long time ago. So it seems kind of unlikely, sadly, that they would still be proper pagans as we might want to think of them.
But we do sort of conceive of that existing in like the 400s, 500s AD in Britain.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, when the early Christian missionaries rock up here, they're absolutely clear that these people are worshipping hills and streams and groves, and this is bad. And we must take over their temples and destroy them. Of course. In a sense, you talked about colonialism.
It's different, kill it.
It is. It's different, kill it. You talked about colonialism, but actually, the first sort of colonial crushing of witchcraft and paganism really happens in the early medieval period. And then later on, because, we're great like that, we export it to the rest of the world.
Wow, we do it to ourselves first just to test it out. Good, very good. Okay, well, we'll get to that. I talked about the witch as kind of an anti-woman. That feels like a too simplistic dichotomy maybe, but what sort of defined a witch? Like, how do you tell what a witch is in the early modern period?
It's a great question, because I've sometimes thought this is something that could happen to any of us, actually. So yes, absolutely, there's a strong strand in people's identification of witches that says they're sort of anti-mothers, or they're anti-feminine, they're not good and silent and modest and all the things that women are supposed to be. So there is that. But at the same time, you get a lot of men accused as well. So we're looking at, if you look at all the records across Europe and North America for that matter, from about, say, 1500 to 1800, you've got about 75% of the people who are accused being female. And that, 75. Of course, 75. And that, of course, leaves a really substantial proportion who are male witches, who we sometimes call witches, sometimes called wizards. There are various different identities there. But that does make you ask more questions, doesn't it, about what people identify. So, anti-women, anti-mothers, yes. But on the other hand, also just people who stand out in some way, people who may be quarrelsome, or people who have a bad reputation because of something that happened earlier in their lives, or people who are seen as difficult in some way, or people with whom you've had a row about your business or, your farm or something. And that actually kind of broadens that definition out far further and makes you start looking for other people. Sometimes the men who are accused are the partners of the female witches. So, the husband, or maybe they're the son. So they're connected to the problematic women in some way. But their identity is also in question. And there's been some really interesting scholarship recently about whether they're seen to be either sort of too masculines. They're kind of quarrelsome and they want to fight in the street and everybody hates them. They're too macho, if you like. And on the other hand, maybe they are seen as too feminine. Maybe they're too close to the women. So there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on there. And sometimes we just don't know. We know somebody was accused. We know virtually nothing about them. So it's really difficult to say why they might have been picked.
So it feels like there is kind of a society-wide fear of different people or people who are quarrelsome or troublesome. But then there's also this kind of randomness to it that is, and that's maybe part of its danger as well. And don't get out of line in any way, because anything could make you a witch. If you sneeze too masculinely, it's going to be you're a witch. Is that kind of fair to say as well?
I think it is kind of fair to say, actually. And, when you look at...
It's terrifying.
It is terrifying. And when you look at the world around you, you can sort of see that echoed. I don't think human beings have changed so much over time that we can't look back to the 16th, 17th century and go, oh, yeah, this person was the one who spoke up in this community. Aha, so you're going to pick on them then. You only got to look at, I was, watching an episode of The Traitors the other night, and it's the people who are too quiet. It's the people who are too noisy. It's the people who have conspiracy theories. It's the people who have nothing to suggest. It's like anyone. It could be anyone. And I find that particularly horrifying.
Yeah, it just keeps everyone on their toes and everyone paranoid. So there is, and to me, there is a real difference actually between that and the ancient world. Because I was just thinking, like, the ancient world is very divided into certain classes in terms of, or statuses rather, like you're free or a slave, or you're barbarian or you're Greek. Like they have these binaries that almost make it easier. Whereas in the Christian era, they're so worried about who am I and am I saved and am I showing everyone else that I'm good? So it's the culture of fear plays a different role there than it might in the ancient world.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And religion has got really complicated. So, you've got the Reformation happening in the sort of 1530s to 40s, where everything is flipping over from Catholic to Protestant, or it's going back to being Catholic, having been Protestant for a bit. And so actually Christianity is split right down the middle, and people really don't know where to sit on that spectrum. And they know if they get it wrong, they might end up going to hell. You can imagine the tension, you can imagine the fear that creates. So in a sense, it is less simple than, the earlier world was. That's perhaps too simple a thing to say, but you're absolutely right that the period of the witch trials is also a really complicated period when it comes to religion and it comes to social status. And it feels like everything's in flux, everything's moving. And you can see why people would have been very anxious and fearful in that time.
Yeah, and able to sort of exploit everyone else's fears and anxieties at the same time. So, okay, I would be remiss if I did not ask you, yes, I get 75, 25. 25 is a big chunk, but 75 is a much bigger chunk. So what is going on in terms of the people that we need to single out for their potential magical harm to the community are women? What is it about women that is so tied to the craft, shall we say?
I think it is partly to do with this sense that women are supposed to be, secondary figures in this society. So, they can't be magistrates, they can't be clergy, they can't get educated in the same way. They are supposed to be lesser. And yet, they're not. They won't shut up. They want things. Oh my God, what do we do about this? That sense that
it's a huge design flaw. It's a huge design flaw,
isn't it? Yes, really. Absolutely. If only they were just these kind of silent little creatures that docilely went about and did what the men wanted, but they're not. So it's
Alas.
partly that, and they, they read it all back onto the figure of Eve. So they look back at the Bible and they go, aha, this has been so since Genesis. Eve was the one who was always going on at Adam, wanted to eat the apple off the tree and, was open to the persuasions of the devil, the serpent. So they think women are inherently subversive, I think, and that also they're open to the devil in ways that men aren't. There's a lot of talk about women's bodies, how they're more open, how there are more ways, if you like, the devil can get in, and how women talk too much, they gossip, they're always thinking up these ideas, they're always talking to each other, and the devil can get involved in speech and he can pervert it and he can put wrong religious ideas into their head. There's all of this kind of seething suspicion of women. And then once you also factor in, women are mothers, women are looking after the next generations of humans, women are nurturing, women are feeding the community. There's also all sorts of ways that they can be seen as a threat to children specifically, and they can be seen as a threat, by poison or by infecting the community with something bad. They really can't win. I think they've been put in this position where it's automatically assumed they're going to be subversive, and then, people invent demonic ways in which they can really enact their fantasies and get that power that they don't have in real life.
Yeah. So many fascinating things in what you just said. I mean, the comparison with Eve, and when you tie that to the idea that being a witch is tied to wisdom, it's almost like any woman who seeks out knowledge risks being called a witch, because that's what Eve did. That's the whole point. And then the idea that there's this like penetrability or permeability, that women are more naturally susceptible to influence or things coming inside and poisoning them or whatever. I mean, the twist at the end that you said also is that women are critical to society in raising the next generation, in nurturing and feeding. So it's like you also do have to be genuinely concerned about their ability to be influenced by just to, play it from their twisted perspective.
Yeah, but you almost feel sorry for the patriarchs, don't you, when you put it like that? The women are absolutely central. But at the same time, they can't be central. They've got to be marginal. How can we square this circle? We can't. And
their poor, feeble male brains just not able to square that circle.
They're just struggling. And I think their anxiety and their paranoia comes out of that. And, that obviously that's a temptation to lash out, isn't it? You find people who are particularly problematic. Oh, look, they happen to be women. And you persecute them. It does feel really simple in some ways, doesn't it? And if you look at it like that, you think, well, why couldn't they just work that one out? But because, humans are who they are, they find all these rationalizations for saying, well, no, this is absolutely true. And, it's not only absolutely true, but God made it absolutely true. So it also cannot be questioned. There are witches. We have to persecute them. Here are the laws against them. The Bible says this, that, and the other about them. Off we go. Let's have a witch trial.
Right. Okay, so good segue, because I was going to ask next, where do we locate the beginning of the witch trial in Europe as we would sort of understand it?
Yeah, it's the 15th century, basically. So it's sort of 14-something. There's a big outbreak of trials in the 1430s. And then in the 1480s, there are some more. And in the 1480s, there are some really influential figures that invent this kind of new science, demonology, as they called it, the study of demons and witches. And they publicise it in new and interesting ways. Because, of course, you've also got the print revolution coming along around about this time. So it's really easy to distribute these new conspiracy theory ideas that the world's full of witches and demons. It's the 15th century when everything really hots up and you start getting beginning of the era of the witch trials.
So can you give us an example of one of those kind of landmark trials that set the precedent for how future ones would be prosecuted?
Yeah, I can. I've got a particularly lovely one that I wrote about in my book from 1485. And it's this fabulous woman called Helena Schäuberin. And she lives in Innsbruck in Austria. And, there she is, a merchant's wife going about her ordinary business. And into town comes an inquisitor an official of the church who actually wants to stage a witch trial. That's what he's looking for. He's become convinced there are witches everywhere. He's done a couple of, if you like, test trials in other towns and cities across southern Germany and Austria. And he's come to Helena's town to do one of these. And she starts having a go at him. She seems to be somebody who's actually quite prepared for him to turn up. And I have wondered how far she is kind of a heretic. Maybe she's really interested in religiosity. I think she has her own views on these matters. And so she starts attacking him. And guess what? Of course, he accuses her, doesn't he? And also at least 6 other women. They're all women in this case. And he starts to hold his witch trial. So the women are imprisoned, they're questioned. There's a question whether they will be tortured or not. It doesn't actually progress that far. They're brought to trial first. And she stands there in court and she defies him. Which is why I particularly like this trial, because it kind of doesn't play out the way you'd expect. So, she's accused of killing somebody who was said to have been her lover. She's accused of using apparently child's flesh in her magic. Some of the other women are accused of poisoning, and they're accused of killing people who are their clients in healing businesses. And she just says, this is rubbish. You've got all of this wrong. You have no authority to put these people on trial. You haven't even gone through the proper process. You've just kind of plucked us off the streets and thrown us into prison. This is ridiculous.
She's checking the receipts. Yes.
She is. And she goes out and she gets herself a lawyer and she fights back. And it's absolutely brilliant. Yeah. And not to kind of spoiler alert, not to go too far down the road of saying exactly what happens, but they get off. They're actually able to extract themselves from this witch trial. But the inquisitor, the chap who has come to town to cause all of this trouble, is so annoyed and upset by this challenge to his authority that he goes away and he writes a big demonological textbook called Malleus Maleficarum, which people might have heard of, the Hammer of Witches.
I've heard of that. And
he publishes it. And in a sense, what the trial does is focus his attention on this and produce this manual of witch hunting, which, along with other manuals, then circulates around Europe. So in a sense, the outcome is bad because it means there are more witch trials, that it feeds his paranoia and he becomes more and more convinced that, we should have more of these things. This one's failed, but surely we can hold some more successful ones soon.
God, it's Elon Musk and his rockets. It's just, one blows up, he just goes and makes it. That is fascinating. And I love that you started with a happy ending. That she fought back and she had the wherewithal to, and I guess the means. I mean, so you said she was a merchant's wife, so she was of a certain position. Yes,
that really helped her. And in a lot of the later cases, obviously, people are just very ordinary women.
Right.
They're poor. Some of them are even beggars. They're people who are very vulnerable and they just don't have the resources to fight back in the same way. So, a lot of witch trials do not end in acquittal and don't end with everybody going home at the end of the day. But that one does. And I did think it was important to start with that because you've talked about how it's sort of history of resistance. And I think it is. In important ways, I think it is. People did answer back to the witch finders. They went down fighting and sometimes they won. And I think that's actually quite important, quite inspiring.
Fuck yeah. What was her name again?
Helena Schäuberin.
Helena Schäuberin. Okay.
Shout her name, yes.
Say her name. Toast to her with my tepid tea here.
Aren't you loving this episode? Welcome to The Refill, folks, where we are, as usual, stopping to thank our newest patrons. Thank you to Rose Errors with a very cool styled username there. We appreciate you using some of your limited human dollars to help us make sure that we keep making this queer as hell show for you to enjoy every week. Thank you to our supporting producer level patrons, Alicia, Hannah, Scott, Ann, Matthew, Lily, and Will, and our legend level patrons, Captain Jonathan, Malachi, Cosmos, Audra, Sarah, BME Up Scotty, Morgan, Bex, Rico Like, Chibi Yokai, and Michael. To join these ranks, have your name read out loud here on Spirits and get extras like weekly notes for every single episode, like more of what we're thinking and doing and feeling and links that you're going to enjoy, all of that great stuff. That's over on the Patreon. You can get cocktail and mocktail recipe cards for every single episode. Yes, all 480 something of them on the Patreon. You can get an additional whole Urban Legends episode every freaking month. And sometimes, I'm not going to lie to you, sometimes we save stories we really love for the Patreon because we want you to love it. All of that you can get at patreon.com/spiritspodcast. As you know, Multitude, our podcast collective, is pumping out incredible episodes of entertaining and informative podcasts every dang week. And I want to make sure that you are enjoying Wow If True. This is your one-stop internet culture shop explaining how what's happening online shapes the real world. Hosted by Amanda Silberling, who's a tech culture journalist, amateur potter, and person very into Pokemon, and the science fiction author / former attorney, Isabel J. Kim Esquire. If you have ever, like me, been thrilled at the idea of both Neopets and horizontal mergers being mentioned in the same episode, this is the show for you. Like, let's stop playing. Go listen to Wow If True. Check them out wherever on the internet you find your podcasts, with new episodes every other Wednesday. As you all know, the U.S.'s fascism has taken its mask off, and we are here in this country trying really hard, many of us at least, to fight against this fascist incursion, and particularly how they are targeting our immigrant or brown, black, and thought to be immigrant neighbors. Specifically, we are donating our ad space here on the show to help mutual aid efforts in small businesses in Minneapolis, a city that has been a real source of inspiration for resistance, but is also being targeted, and it's not done being targeted, by ICE and the U.S. state. So in one small way, you can help feed people, immigrants, neighbors, people fighting the good fight, over in Minneapolis by buying a gift card to El Burrito Mercado. This is a small business in Minneapolis that sells food, but also groceries, Mexican goods, and overall trying to feed people and make people feel at home when they specifically, desperately need that right now. So if you want to support their work, feeding protesters, feeding neighbors, giving food away, working with the nonprofit Neighbor House Minneapolis, you can go ahead and do that by buying a digital gift card for El Burrito Mercado and listing gift cards at neighborhoodhousemn.org as the email address for the recipient. All that info is in the episode description. You're basically buying a gift card and sending it to this nonprofit Neighborhood House, which will then pay El Burrito Mercado to make food that people actually want because it's food that they know and love, and then send it to people who need food right now. That is really necessary. There are a ton of mutual aid efforts and other businesses you can support at bit.ly/MN podcast ads, all lowercase. So help us out, buy a gift card, help feed the resistance, help feed our neighbors. Thank you.
Okay, so Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, comes out 1480s, big pub date, and then it kind of spreads all over Europe. Does that lead to an acceleration in the number of witch hunts and number of witch trials that happen?
Yeah, I'm afraid it does. I mean, there are other textbooks too. You know, it's not the only one by any means. There are a lot of them. And this is, you know how it feels in today's society that sometimes you can't put your finger on exactly where a conspiracy theory started or exactly where a political movement that you don't favour started. There's that sort of sense that there's been a sea change. You know, times have changed and people are looking for new enemies. And so throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, there's this, you know, increasing tide of witchcraft prosecutions.
So let's talk about the year 1600. And for some reason that put into my mind, and the word demonology, that put into my mind a previous subject of this podcast, King James VI and First,
yes,
who wrote that book. Well, he wrote a book called Demonology, didn't he? He
did.
Yeah. So let's check in on James. What's happening by the time we get to 1600? And I want to talk about his contribution to this and how it set up the American witch trials as well that would come in the 17th century.
Yeah, so he thinks he's been under attack by witches, basically. You know, James has a really difficult life in a lot of ways. He's pushed onto the throne as a baby because his mother's been deposed. People try to kill him throughout his childhood and abduct him and, you know, take over his country, Scotland, because he's King of Scots at the time. And in the 1590s, he starts to think that he's under attack by witches as well, that his political opponents are using witchcraft against him. He's gone off to get married in Denmark, so he's brought his new queen back.
Poor woman.
Yes, I know. Yes. And everybody, of course, is talking about this. And, you know, they're concerned about whether the king will have an heir. They're concerned about whether the country's going to, you know, just degenerate into political turmoil again. There's this massive anxiety. And James starts thinking, well, you know, there were storms on the way back from Denmark. This has all been very difficult. Me and my new wife have had a very difficult time. It's witches, isn't it? So he and others start to look for witches in their community, and they find some predominantly women, some men, in the area around Edinburgh, the national capital, and they hold a big witch trial. And this goes very badly for the people who have been accused, unfortunately, and they are executed. But James feels quite vindicated and quite pleased because, you know, from his point of view, he's proved that the witches were indeed after him. And that this explains all his political troubles and all his marital troubles, and this is fine. So in 1597, he writes this book, Demonology, which explores his ideas about witches and demons. And then in 1603, Queen Elizabeth of England dies, and he is her heir. So he comes to the throne of England as well as the throne of Scotland. And in 1604, the year after that, there is a new Witchcraft Act across both of the kingdoms, which makes the penalties for practicing witchcraft much harsher. You're much more likely to get executed for various witchcraft crimes than you were before. So it does feel like he and the people around him initiate a crackdown on witches. Subsequently, he kind of changes his mind to some extent. He becomes really interested in smoking out people who've made false witchcraft accusations. So he does, to that extent, remain open-minded. But in the early 1600s, it's a very bad time to be accused of witchcraft because you're much more likely to get executed. And it's widely believed that the king personally is after you, which doesn't put you in a strong position.
Right. I mean, those poor people in Scotland, that I imagine that trial was very much, look, he thinks that he was attacked by witches. We got to vindicate him in that. And, you know, that was probably kind of gamed from the beginning. I didn't even think about this, that the punishment for witchcraft wouldn't automatically be execution. So that must have come in at a specific time. I mean, or were they always executed?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, there are people who are regarded as witches in like the early medieval period, you know, right from the start of when we get the earlier stories, there are witches in them. And some of those people do get executed, but it's kind of small scale stuff. You know, it's one person here, one person there. It's not this mass trial. So you can be executed in a variety of horrible ways, right from the early medieval period onwards. But there are various changes in the law, and in the kind of high Middle Ages, it's all handed over to the church. And sometimes if you're accused of witchcraft and convicted in a church court, you just get told to do a penance. So it's actually not that bad at all. You know, tut-tut, you know, you've been very naughty, you've used magic, but what you have to do is come to church, you know, wearing a white sheet and carrying a taper and apologising for your sins. And, you know, God will forgive you, it's all right. But in the 1560s, under Queen Elizabeth, so King James's predecessor on the English throne, there's a Witchcraft Act then, and that one it moves everything over to the state, basically. So the state is now the entity that's after witches, and there are death penalties for killing people. But there are lesser punishments, like a year's imprisonment, if you do a lesser crime, you know, maybe you harm animals or something like that. So it sort of works up to the point where almost everything is punishable by death, at least in the British Isles. You know, in other jurisdictions, things are a different shape. It's a really complicated picture. But if you're thinking about King James's world, then that's the kind of history that he's dealing with. And it appears that he and his ministers want to make the punishments harsher at that point.
Right. Damn, I'm so annoyed that Elizabeth I has a Witchcraft Act because she's kind of my favorite, one of my faves. Damn, Lizzie. It's also interesting that it becomes a state crime, like that, because presumably it moves from something that's covered by an ecclesiastical court to something. And
yes,
interestingly, that is similar to the Buggery Act of 1533 or whatever it is, where that moves from becoming an ecclesiastical crime to, or canonical or whatever, to something that the state covers or the civil courts cover. So just an interesting kind of reflection in the queer historical record of like sodomy and witchcraft.
Yeah, I think that's right. They start off as kind of moral crimes, don't they? So they're within the churches. world, this is a sin. So, we deal with it this way.
Right.
But as particularly in the British Isles, as the church gets pushed to the margins and changed and we move from Catholic to Protestant, the state takes over more and more of that territory. So they start saying, well, yeah, it might be a sin, but actually it's also a crime, because we're a godly state, right? So we've decided to legislate against this stuff. And that's why a lot of those sins, if you like, move over into the world of crime, and the state starts pursuing people who are accused of them.
I think that's really important because it means that, whether being a sodomite or being a witch, it means that you are, like you say, you're harming the citizenship, the citizenry, so in a more complex state, it's not just about potential harm to like the children in the local community or whatever. Your goodness or lack thereof as an individual has a direct impact on the broader state. That's a very big conceptual leap, I think, or evolution.
It really is. Yeah, you have become an enemy of the state. And that makes you a kind of traitorous, international criminal. Somebody who absolutely has to be hunted down and got rid of. Because, you're not just a little local problem. You're actually right up against the king or the queen or the government or the parliament or whoever's in charge. And you're a massive threat. It really does change the game, doesn't it? And it makes it just raises the stakes in witchcraft trials because it makes everything worse for the person who is accused, and it makes the accusers even keener to go after them.
Yeah, and we certainly see that, I feel, in the 17th century. And, the Salem witch trials are so famous in American history. So maybe we can talk about those in the next section a bit. But there is that sense of true horror, I think, that starts to creep in of these LOL high stakes trials where what's on trial is not just an individual, but almost like a traitor to the community or the state. So before we get into that next phase of history, we must stop and say hello to Macbeth's witches, because first of all, it's my favorite Shakespeare play. And that opening scene in Macbeth where he meets the witches is fascinating. We get double boil and trouble? Yeah.
Toil and trouble, brilliant.
Toil and trouble. Oh my God. What is it?
Double, toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron bubble.
There we go.
Isn't it great?
That's just magnificent. And it's lasted 400 years. So, although I couldn't remember it just now. But what's interesting, just to go back to this kind of anti-woman thing before we move on, is they are presented in this very weird kind of genderized place where they're sort of, it seems like they're meant to be kind of disgusting, but they're also very bawdy. There's almost an element of them skirting the edges of, the boundary between male and female, between like public and private, between castrated male, and all these interesting things. What does this literary representation of witches tell us about how they were perceived at the time? And also their kind of burgeoning queerness, I want to say.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you can imagine seeing them on the stage. And everybody on the stage is male because women are not allowed to appear on the Jacobean stage. Exactly. So you've got this spectacle where you've got supposedly witches, supposedly women who are referred to as weird sisters. But yet one of the characters says you should be women, but your beards forbid me to interpret you that way. So they're referring to the real actors who may well have beards, who are playing women. So there's that really interesting, reversal of gender. There's that really interesting unreadability and queerness about them. But they're also kind of gesturing because the witches are these frightening figures who are, about to challenge the state and make Macbeth murder the king and all the rest of it. They're these really threatening figures, but they're also mixing up queerness with that. So it is seen to be part of the sort of uncanniness of the witches as well. So it's kind of a little joke. Oh, look, they're all male actors, which Shakespeare does a lot. He does that a lot in his plays. He really enjoys doing that. But on the other hand, it's also more sinister. It's more like, oh, we're not sure what these creatures are. Are they even human? Are they male? Are they female? Are they something in between? Are they something else? Are they made of earth? Are they made of water? What are they? And that's really powerful, I think. I think he is playing with those kind of big ideas about the inability to pin somebody down and say, right, you are this, you are controllable. This is what you are. Those figures can't be pinned down. I think that's part of their witchiness.
Oh my God, that's so interesting. I mean, I never ever thought about how it's kind of like, we're starting the play now. Like, I'm a witch with a beard, but I'm also a dude. And like playing that kind of boundary. But then as you're saying, it grows into something that is way more troubling of how do we know who people are? How do we, because Macbeth is loyal in the beginning, right? I mean, and then he gets persuaded by the witches, as you said. So that's the problem, is that someone is changeable like that, right? Oh, that's so fascinating.
It's so cool, isn't it?
Oh, come on. And come you spirits unsex me here, talking about, queer cues. Love my Lady Macbeth. So, okay, I think there's something interesting here where we're getting a kind of queer precedents that are starting to bubble up in terms of, there's kind of something similar about the way that sodomites and witches might have been thought about in this period. There's also this idea that witches, male or female, are witches insofar as they subvert gender norms to some extent. So women are anti-women, women are anti-mothers, and maybe men are too feminine or too masculine, and that's what makes them a witch. So that's an interesting precedent to have culturally. And of course, the precedent of the witch hunt will become copycatted for gay witch hunts that happen in later centuries.
Yes.
So before we get to the modern era, I want to talk about how Europe decided to colonize everyone ever, because they're so, so cool. And they brought their fear of witchcraft with them, as you said earlier. So let's turn to that now. Act 2, The Witches' Semester Abroad. Okay, so we are going into the 1700s, 1800s. I mean, obviously the age of discovery was happening before that. We were encountering Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, all sorts of civilizations, indigenous populations, especially in the Americas, not to mention populations in Africa, where white Europeans would be encountering magical folk in various communities. Why is this important? I mean, how does this influence the history of witchcraft and the way that the West comes to think about witches?
I think it's part of what we've talked about already, in that there's this inherent fear of difference. So obviously, you can find all of that within your own society if people are different from you in some way. But when their skin is also a different color, their clothing is different, their religion is different, their customs are different, the entire place where they live is unfamiliar to you, then the temptation gets even stronger to say, oh, well, these people are different from us. Maybe they're not really people at all. Or if they are, their religion may be problematic. It looks a lot like devil worship to us. Who are these deities that they worship? What are these rites that they're doing? If you come there with this kind of self-righteous perspective that you are, the dominant people in your world and your way is the right way and it is God's way, then it's really easy for early colonists to look at the people around them and start associating them with evil types of magic.
I hadn't really considered that, how anyone who is not yet a Christian, who's an indigenous part of an indigenous community, is basically being influenced by the devil still. Like, that's the problem, really, is they just haven't met Jesus yet.
Yeah. It is hideous, isn't it? The idea that people went out into the world and they didn't see different and beautiful religions and practices. All they saw was something that is not us and therefore must be demonic. It's such a distressing period of history in so many ways, and so disappointing.
But it does show how much they believed the word of God came from God, because you don't make that assumption about everyone else in the world unless you fully believe in revelation, I guess.
Yeah.
In a way, it's like their belief in their own kind of magic is so strong that they condemn any other kind.
Yeah, that's very perceptive. And I think, you also make a great point that they actually were in earnest. It's quite easy to see them as cynical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, they just wanted to take the indigenous people's land. And so they say, oh, well, they're devil worshippers, aren't they?
That too.
That
I
too.
mean, they did want that too.
They did want that too. But they didn't sit down and, you know, make a list of, well, what do we want to achieve here? Right. Let's accuse the indigenous people of witchcraft. They really did believe this stuff. They were in complete earnest. They believed they were doing good in the world. And if doing good meant, you know, torturing people and executing them, well, you know, so be it. It's God's will.
Right. So there must be a tipping point that happens where the influence of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, becomes stronger. And in the West, we do sort of stop persecuting people for witchcraft. When does that taper off when we're persecuting our own?
Kind of just after Salem, really, in a lot of places.
Okay, that's the last great hurrah.
It is one of the last great hurrahs. Yes, it is. So after that, people start looking at, you know, just the devastation of the Salem trials. You know, you've got 200 or 300 people in prison. 20 people have died as a result of it. The whole thing has had to be reversed by the colonial authorities who've come to believe it's a massive miscarriage of justice. You know, it just looks awful for everybody. So after that point, you know, the sort of mid-1690s, people do start looking again at the idea of the witch. They don't necessarily stop believing in witches, but they do start to ask quite good questions about the nature of evidence in trials and whether really so many people are witches and whether they're being punished in the right way. And what's the right thing to do about them, really? So at that point, yeah, kind of the sort of early bits of the scientific revolution, if you like, come up against a sort of sea change in judicial practices and what people think of as being right. In a sense, society gets more tolerant. It's very slow and it doesn't all happen at once. And, you know, you're still getting people persecuted across the 18th century in large parts of Europe. But you could say that the sort of step change was round about, say, 1700 or something like that.
So for once, we have the lawyers to thank.
Yes, actually you do. They do start asking better questions, yes.
I mean, that's really interesting because you do kind of think of all of the medieval tests, you know, that for how do you know if a witch is a witch? What's the one where you like throw her with rocks into a river and then if she sinks, she's a witch, but like she's dead already? Or there's something crazy like that.
There's a water ordeal, basically. So, yeah, you throw somebody into water. And your thinking is that, oh, well, you know, water is the holy water of baptism. So if she's renounced her baptism and she's become a devil worshipper, then the water will kind of spit her out. And there's a lot of arguments about that in the 16th and 17th centuries. You know, people saying, oh, no, that can't be right. And other people saying, yes, that's, of course, that's the absolute proof. They did try and pull people out before they drowned and, you know, in most cases succeeded. But people did die as a result of that. And again, it's very hard to look back into the past and think of these people as rational and earnest and good people, isn't it? But they thought they were doing the right thing.
Right. It made sense in their worldview in some way. Okay. That, as difficult as it is to admit, again, thank you to the lawyers. So, and then it feels like there must be a moment, though, where witchcraft is kind of something that almost becomes an anthropological study of we in the West are Christian. We don't have witchcraft. We don't really accuse people of witchcraft anymore. But we're going all over the world, colonizing, trying to, you know, acquire all of these different territories for various reasons when people would still be encountering witchcraft in those communities in one way or another. Is it fair to say that there's sort of an exoticizing of witchcraft, that it becomes something that like other far away people do that makes them different?
Yeah, I think that's right. And colonial administrators go out across the world and they find practices that they find reminiscent of their own past. So, you know, yeah, they do find witch trials. They find communities that believe in witchcraft and persecute witches and have them executed. But of course, now they've changed their minds about what they think about witchcraft. They then start intervening in those witch trials. They then start looking at the practices they find around them. And they either try to stop the trials and find different ways for the communities to think about the magic that's inherent in their religion. Or in some cases, they are Christian people going out and they see witch trials and they sort of join in with them. So they're like, yes, well, absolutely, these people are witches. And neither response is helpful.
Just add one more in. Yeah, just add one more in for good measure.
Unsurprisingly, neither practice is helpful. And it leaves the communities that they've gone into, I think, genuinely shell-shocked and culture-shocked and confused and really not knowing what to do. And I think there is a big legacy of witch hunting across the world. It is partly the legacy of Christian missionaries, which again is a really depressing thing, isn't it? People who went there, you know, in their own way to do good as they thought, but actually ended up taking with them all the assumptions about witchcraft from their own culture, whether that was persecuting witches or wading into indigenous cultures to, you know, to stop them believing in magic and thus smashing them up.
Right. Right. And in so doing, kind of affirming their perceived status about themselves, that they are the civilized ones, the Christian ones, the good ones, and that witchcraft is almost a marker of that more uncivilized status. So it kind of, I guess it's sort of a form of confirmation bias of, oh yeah, these people are so uncivilized, so they're doing witchcraft and we need to help them get rid of that, and that's why we're gonna fund this witch trial.
Yeah, and once again, you know, we're also going to take over their country while we're here.
Right. They can't handle anything. We need to step in and do this. God, we're the worst. So, okay. And then last question on the kind of queer history front on this part. Is there still this association with witchcraft and kind of like gender fluidity or non-normative sexuality in colonized societies? Do we know anything about that?
Yes, we do. I mean, you probably have seen in recent news that actually in some communities, so sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the world, actually there is a complete link between those two states. So it is gay people who are being prosecuted as witches because homosexuality is thought to be some kind of demonic affliction. And thus, you know, if you are gay, you're also a witch. Or you've been afflicted by witches and turned gay. And somehow a sort of spirit of a witch has got into you. And, you know, you have to be exorcised. You have to be tried. You have to be persecuted and exiled. So actually, yes, there is this enduring link between queerness and witchcraft throughout history.
And that's a point that really sticks out to me, that there's an idea of contagion when it comes to witchcraft that is very much inherited by witch hunts of gay people. You know, like the idea that influence is really we were talking about children and child rearing and the influence of witches. Like that's the real problem, is the influence that the witch can have, or the homosexual.
Yes, I think it is. And that's a kind of magical influence. You know, that's something that the observer can't control, can't see, can't stop. It's kind of intangible. And I think that very much overlaps with the idea of how magic works. You know, that's how spells work. That's how charms work. You can't, there's no preventative against them.
Yeah, you can't really see it. You can't really control it. That's very interesting. Okay, so their influence is magical. Gay people's influence is magical, and that's why we have to stop it. Okay, so it seems like to me the othering, the exoticization, is that a word, of witchcraft abroad only made it more exciting in a way for people in the West, right? Because if you have this stuff that happens in these unknown lands, then it becomes something that becomes the stuff literally of fairy tales. And it feels like in the 20th century, that, and I'm sure there's a much more interesting literary history we can track here, but it feels like that feeds directly into this more modern fascination with witches, especially for little gay boys like me in 1991. But in our next and final act, I just want to turn to that kind of coming together of witchcraft and queerness and otherness that happens in the 20th century. So let's turn to that now. Act 3, Witchcraft Goes Gay. Okay, before we get into my favorite pop culture witches of all time, I would like to discuss another moment in British history, which I know nothing about, but is really interesting to me. People in the Victorian era were kind of obsessed with spirits and like the occult. Where does that come from?
They were. It was, if you like, a kind of re-importing of all the ideas about witchcraft and magic that they'd been at such pains to drive out of their own. They kind of want to start re-importing it. So in the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of Victorian intellectuals who don't really want to live in a repressive Victorian Christian world start thinking, well, over there's paganism, over there's polytheism. Oh, look, over there's magic. Maybe we could have some of that. So from India, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Africa, they start re-importing the ideas of magic so that they can benefit from some of the upsides of it, some of the sort of fantasies that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, getting a little sexy, getting a little gay, like maybe getting into the occult allows us to do that. So speaking of that, I mean, there's just this one guy that I've always been wondering about that I should just do research on, but I haven't had the time, whose name is Aleister Crowley. Is that how you say his name?
It is.
Who is he? Because he's a major occultist and he founds his own religion and is also very famously like super gay, well, bisexual, but definitely not cis het vibes. So what was his deal? How does he play into this?
Yeah, it will not surprise you to learn that he's brought up by a very repressive Christian sect. And a lot of the rest of his life just kind of flows from that because perfectly fairly, he wants to reject that. He kind of goes crazy with it, really. So he is into absolutely everything. Any type of magic that he can practice, any type of sexuality that he can experience, anything that he can do to shock people and upset them is what he will do. And he does become he's kind of a media superstar, really, because he's the sort of person that the press love to hate. And he plays up to that. He actually really enjoys that kind of attention. So he does indeed get involved with these early movements towards founding a new kind of paganism. And he increasingly moves towards founding his own particular version of that religion. And it's really influential even today. Even when people find some of his excesses problematic, they will still say, well, yes, he's one of the founders of what we believe in, because at least he rejected the idea that everybody had to be heterosexual, everybody had to be Christian, everybody had to conform to particular gender stereotypes and political views and religious views. And he suggested that there were other ways of experiencing the world, many of which were a lot freer. So Crowley's really important. Yeah, he's a really problematic figure in a lot of ways, but he also does an awful lot of revolutionary work, which is very handy for future generations.
Okay, Aleister Crowley. Okay, we're going to have to do an episode on him at some point. But it feels like that is a real coming together of these strands of queerness and witchiness. And like you're saying, he's kind of a gay influencer in the early 20th century, late 19th century?
Yeah, late 19th, early 20th. Yes.
Right. So, and then the other connection that I just made is that in the article that I was reading this week about how many Wiccans identify as queer, they mentioned that a lot of them come from fundamentalist Christian households. So there does seem to be this real kind of pipeline of you get this very repressive environment that you grow up in, and then witchcraft, paganism has a kind of liberating effect on people who also come to realize that they're queer or, don't want to live in such repressive ways. So there's a real natural intersection there between I'm queer, I need to live in a more sexually liberated way, and here's this ideology that welcomes that rather than fearing it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's because of all the history we've talked about, witches become associated with difference. They do become associated with queerness and uncategorability or something like that.
Yeah.
They become associated with stepping out of your comfort zone or the comfort zone of people around you and doing something different. So you can understand why the witch becomes this figure that people want to go back to and reclaim. And that happens all the way out throughout the 20th century, and it's still happening today.
So there's something that ties directly in my mind to what we said about how there's a bit of a randomness about what makes a witch. Like the fact that the witch is kind of a malleable figure and is just defined by this otherness allows a lot of different types of people to identify with her/him, with them. So that's something that is really interesting when I think about the pop culture expansion of the witch that happens in the rest of the 20th century. Because, I mean, you get the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, classic. I mean, we also have the nice witch in Bewitched, right? I can't remember her name. I never really watched that. See, that's not my vibe. That's not powerful enough. I need people who are like fighting evil. But there's clearly something fascinating about witches to pop culture as the women's rights movement emerges, right? I mean, that there must be a relationship between the emergence of feminism and all of these very different portrayals of witches that get added to our cultural plate.
Yeah, there is. And again, it happens like as early as the 1880s, particularly American feminists are starting to notice there's this long history of persecuting women in witch trials. What do we do about that? So there's a particularly interesting American feminist called Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who happens to be the mother-in-law of Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz. So think about that. Hold that thought. And she writes this book called Woman, Church and State, and it's really all about how she believes Christianity has oppressed women throughout its history and how it would be much better if they followed the model as she sees it of what witches were up to, which is a lot more pagan, is a lot more intuitive, is a lot more in touch with their femininity. And she's also really into kind of semi-magical stuff like, extrasensory perception, what they called animal magnetism or hypnotism. And she associates all that with witches. And she's basically pushing people, early feminists, suffragists like she is, people who want to vote for women. She's pushing them towards a magical identity really as early as the 1880s. And it only gets stronger. And yeah, it does absolutely. 100 years later, it's built towards figures like Willow in Buffy, the witches in Charmed. You can see love, absolutely. You can see their roots going all the way back a century to women who started thinking, well, actually, I'm a bit more like a witch than I am like a Christian clergyman, aren't I? What am I going to do with that knowledge?
Right. And that, to me, that goes back to this idea of a witch as a woman who wants knowledge or who seeks knowledge in different channels or from different sources other than the sort of received ones, sources of received wisdom. And okay, last bomb to just drop in here that I just thought of. But is there also, do you think, maybe something about environmentalism and kind of anti-industrial sentiment and this interest in witchcraft? Because witchcraft is also kind of a return to nature in a way. It's, again, along this idea of different sources of knowledge, different sources of power. Do you see any connections there in what's happened to witchcraft in the popular imagination?
Yeah, I do. Yes. I think people have very much framed witchcraft as being a kind of, a return to nature, a sort of eco-spirituality, if you like. They often talk about the goddess as being, the world, as Gaia. All that has come together in modern culture, I think. So a lot of people who identify as witches will also say, well, I'm an eco-feminist or, I'm interested in sustainability. And however they want to frame that, I think that is all really interesting. It does tend to associate witches with the rural, which isn't always the case. There were urban witches too. There were witch trials in towns and cities and so on and blah, blah. But I think the way that it's been reframed for modern culture is very much associated with the rural and the wild. So, the idea that you're a wild woman is really popular. And if that empowers people, brilliant. I'm always really pleased when somebody says, oh, I identify as a witch, or, this is what like you were saying, I've experimented with this. Maybe it's not for me, but I found it really fascinating. I think that's absolutely brilliant. When I first came into being interested in witch trials, I was very much, it's all in the past. But it really isn't. It's all around us.
Yeah. Oh, what a fabulous place to end. So, this has been so fascinating. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If it's your first time listening to a Historical Homos episode, welcome. You are officially one of our little historical hormones. If you like what you hear, please leave us a 5-star only, of course, review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps the podcast so much. We have also recently launched a Patreon. So if you want to check out how you can support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/historicalhomos and check out all of our fun tiers. You get access to bonus content. You get the right to vote on future episode topics. If you would like to merely keep abreast and a testicle of all things Historical Homos, you can follow us on Instagram at historical.homos or sign up for our weekly email on our website at www.historicalhomos.com. Love you. Bye.